How's it going, YouTube? Dylan here. In this video, we're going to do part 2 of our series on iOS development for beginners. And in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to parse data from a JSON and display it in the table view. Now, this is one of the most important concepts that you need to know because in every take-home project that I've done, it's always been some sort of variation of this where you had to get some sort of a JSON and you have to display it in a table view, right? And obviously there's more to that than that, but this is the absolute basics and this is what you really want to know. So if you haven't watched the last video, I do recommend that you go ahead and watch that, as it's also very important to understand the basics and just understanding what a table view is, why it's important, and how to do it with dummy data. So to kind of do a quick review there, if we run this app, basically what we did was we were able to display dummy data inside of a table view, right? As you can see here, there are 10 table view cells and it's displayed in a table view. So in this video, what we're going to do today is we're going to learn how to get this from a JSON data. Because if you think about it, in the real world, you're probably not going to use dummy data. You're going to get it from external servers because, hey, why just create your own data when you can use somebody else's, you know what I mean? So without further ado, let's not waste any time and let's get right into it. So what we want to do is we want to create a new file. I'm going to create a new Swift file, by the way, and we're going to click next. We're going to call this get data from JSON. Click enter, and that's going to be our file, right? So obviously we're going to call this class get data from JSON, and we're going to be into the function. So what we're going to do today is we're going to use the following URL and we're going to parse it inside of our we're going to parse it from this JSON here. So this is basically pokeapi.co. If you take a look here, you can see that it's just like a list of Pokemon. So that's basically what we're going to use for this tutorial here today. And I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it inside of our string. So we're going to call this URL string over here. Right? And this is just going to be our URL, right? So now we're going to call our func get data, where we're going to do our parsing of the JSON, and I'm going to have a completion escaping, and it's going to take in of type void and going to exit of type void, right? So we're not going to pass in anything, we're not going to return anything. It's just a completion handler like that, right? So the first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we have a valid URL. And how do we do that? Well, to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I have a guard statement. So let URL is equal to URL, and it's going to be a string, and we're going to pass in our URL string, right? And then basically the nice thing about guard statements is it lets you know if it's basically a way to protect yourself of if it doesn't happen, right? So guard let URL is equal to URL string. Make sure that this is valid. Otherwise, we're going to do a print statement saying that URL is invalid. Try again. Right? So this is how we know that our URL is valid or invalid. If this never happens, then we know that our URL is valid and we can successfully get data from this particular URL, right? So you can see here that it's complaining that we need to have a return statement, which is exactly what we're going to do, but we also need to make sure that we have our completion handler, which is going to be over there, right? So the next thing that we want to do is we want to launch our session. which is going to be URL session configuration, and we're going to just set it to default. So that's what we're doing here, is we're just going to launch our session, right? And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to launch a task, because we have to give it a task to parse data from our JSON, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to let task is equal to session dot data task with completion handler. And what we're going to do in our URL request is we're going to take this one, our URL, and we're going to put it here. So what is this completion handler? What we're going to do is we're going to click enter, and we're going to have this thing over here, which looks like a funny function. This is called a closure. And for the context of this, what it's all about is if you option and you click, it gives you a summary. So I'm going to give you the TLDR of what we need to know. So our data is going to be what data that we get out of it, right? So our data is going to be everything that we have here, right? It's going to be our B-drill, it's going to be our Kakuna, it's going to be our count, our next, our previous, our results. That's going to be the most important thing that we're going to get out of it. Now, what is URL response? Well, URL response is going to be the HTTP request from the actual server. Now, this can be helpful when you're debugging things, but obviously there's a lot of HTTP responses, and this can help you debug in the case that you're not getting the results that you're looking for, in terms of you're not getting the URL. And it's a lot better than just saying, putting print statements and saying, hey, you know, we couldn't find the URL or something like that. So this is a more advanced way for you to debug. I'm going to include the link to this developer.mozilla link in the description below so that you can understand it. But most of the times it's going to be, you know, bad requests, unauthorized, forbidden, 404 not found. You have probably seen a lot of this when you're surfing around on the internet, right? So that's basically what the URL response is. Let's go back to our app here, right? And error is self-explanatory if there's an error for some reason, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to define data, we're going to define response, and we're going to define error. So generally, if you're not using any of these data, you could also put this, and we could put like an underscore to tell you that you're not using this. But if you're a beginner, just define all the variables. I recommend that. And then as you start to get a little bit more advanced, then you'll know when you're not using specific variables, and that's pretty much when you can use those underscores, right? So with that being said, what do we put inside of the task, right? So what we want to do is we want to check to see if we get an error. So if let error is equal to error, because it is an optional, there could be a chance that, you know, there is a nil value. So that's what the if let actually does. And we're just going to print there was an error, try again, right? And the most important part is actually decoding our data, right? So we want to get our data response, right? So what we want to do is we want to let decoded data equal to try JSON decoder. So you can see that it creates a new reusable JSON decoder with the default formatting settings and decoding strategies. .decode returns a value of the type you specify, decoded from a JSON object, right? And that's exactly what we need in this example. So we just define data to be here as we have defined it here, because obviously we're going to need that, right? And then we have this thing called decodable.protocol. Now what is this, right? Well, we explained what a protocol is in the last video, but what we need to do is we need to, you know, get the values from our URL. So how do we do that? What we want to do is we want to create a struct, which I like to call returned, and we want to have it of type decodable. Decodable. A type that can decode itself from an external representation. Now you could also use codable, and it's going to do the same thing. And basically what this does is it can encode and decode, right? So decode is basically self-explanatory. It can decode all the data that you get from a JSON response. So codable allows you to encode and turn it into a JSON, as well as decode and turn JSON into a format that Swift can understand, right? So that's basically what it's all about. Honestly, it doesn't really matter if you use decodable versus codable, right? I use both interchangeably, so it is what it is, right? So that's kind of what you want to do there. And then also we want to create an array, which we're going to return, right? So now what we want to do is we want to look at our URL to see what type that we actually want to return. Well, in this case, what we want to return is we want to return this name here, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to first get all these values here. Actually, I'm going to go back to my app here, and I'm going to let count is an integer, let next is equal to string of type optional, as it could be a nil value, as you can see in our previous here. Next can be a null value and previous can be a null value, which is why we have string question mark. Let previous equals to string. Just make sure that I spelled that right. Yep, I spelled that right. And lastly, let results of type results. Now, why am I doing this? Well, we see here in our JSON response that we have the square bracket. So I need to define another struct in order to access the name and the URL, right? So that's exactly why I'm doing that. So struct results is of type decodable, and I'm going to let name to be of a string and let URL also of type string. So let me go back and verify that is correct. So we can see here that now we can define our returned dot self to be here, and the errors will go away, kind of, but we need a catch in order to handle this. There was an error decoding your data. Try again. So what this is going to do is just decode of type returned, right? And you can see here that we have data is going to be an optional value. Since we have this do catch phrase, it's okay to force unwrap it, which is what this exclamation mark is actually doing. Generally, you want to avoid force unwrapping as much as possible, as it's not as safe as having your error handling be, for example, of type 0. But in this particular case, it is okay to actually do so to force unwrap. So that's why I'm doing it here, right? So now begs the question, I need to create an array which I can eventually use in my table view. How do I do that? Well, in order to do that, what I want to do is I want to define an array. So I'm going to have a var of, I'm going to call it Pokemon array. And this is going to be of type results, because you want to access the name, right? And this is just going to start off as an empty array. Now, in order to add data to this, what we're going to do is we're going to call self.Pokemon array plus minus decoded data dot results, right? And what this is going to do is going to allow us to get the entire JSON response so that we can access any element at any time, right? You can also do results dot name, for example, if you wanted to just access the name, but let's make this as convenient and as easy as possible, and we're just gonna get the entire JSON response. Now, what we need to do to finish off this JSON response is completion, and then we're going to have our task.resume. And this is going to help to start the data task session and get all our decoded data, right? So let's go back into the view controller, and now let's display the values inside of our table view, right? So in order to do that, what we want to do is we want to actually have a print statement here so that you guys can get the decoded data, and let's display that. Decoded data, right? And then we're going to go into main. What we're going to do is we're going to first define our let get data from JSON to be get data from JSON so that we can access that Swift file, right? So what we want to do is we want to get data from JSON dot get data, and it's going to allow us to have a completion and allow us to put some code here so that it can be displayed in our table view, right? And I'm going to explain this in a little bit, but let's handle the table view stuff in order for us to actually display values, right? So what we want to do is we want to define this to be get data from JSON.Pokemon array index path.row .name, since we want to display the name, right? And then we want to replace array with get data from JSON.Pokemon array.count, right? And then I'm going to comment that out because you don't need the dummy data anymore. And what we want to do is, this is a really important concept, right? So right now the get data is running in the background thread, right? But we want to display all the values from the data inside of our main thread that's going to be displayed to the user, right? So if you understand hardware and you understand what CPUs are, most CPUs are, you know, multi-threaded, right? It's going to be a 2-core CPU, it's going to be a 4-core CPU, it's going to be an 8-core CPU. The only difference between how many cores that it has is how many instructions it can handle at one time, right? So in order to display values inside of our table view, which is our UI component, it's going to be on the main thread. We need to move the get data to the main thread in order to reload the values from the table view and put them into the we're going to get the data and reload our table view in order to display those values inside of our table view, right? So we're going to get our data, we're going to reload our table view so that we can display all the values inside of that table view, right? So in order to do that, we're going to use dispatch queue dot main dot async, and we're going to do table view dot reload data, and this is obviously going to be a self, right? Self dot table view dot reload data. What this is going to allow us to do is going to allow us to get our data from our JSON, move this to the main thread, and reload data so that we can get our values from our JSON onto the main thread and display the values inside of our table view. Now what we're going to do is we're going to build, which is command B, build succeeded, and we're going to run. And as you can see there, we have all our values, right? And we can see here that we have all our name, we have our URL here, and everything is working great. So that's a tutorial for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the next video, as I'm going to talk about how to, when you reload this, when you scroll to the bottom, how do you get more results, right? And I'm going to also talk about some advanced concepts so that you can impress your interviewers when you have take-homes in future series. So if you guys enjoyed this video, give it a like, Tell me what you thought about it in the comment section below, and make sure you hit that subscribe button, as it really helps support the channel and lets me know that you enjoy content like this. So without further ado, I'll see you on the next video.